So we finally named this segment where we take turns to discuss a little something about our specialties in a series of short videos, and we call it Round Table.
Good day, everybody. My name is Berman Magat, and today I'll be presenting to you a service guide for Kingfisher and Kite. So the service guide is focused on a set of commandments, and the set of commandments are things you can remember when you're trying to communicate ideas or sell products as your job, or maybe just when you're trying to talk to somebody and you're trying to convince them of something. So these are commandments that I've listed down as a guide from years of experience working as a sales associate and working very closely with artisans in small scale luxury craft type business models. So in these business models, there's a highly personalized service focused on delivering highly personalized products, which are often termed bespoke. So to give you an idea of what bespoke is building from the ground up, meaning we start with nothing except a general idea of what it is that you're offering, for example, a suit. And a bespoke suit is based on one person's body measurements. So we measure the body, we make a pattern, and from this pattern, we make a 2D model from which we make a cutout, trace it on the cloth, and the cloth is cut, put together, you have a 3D model, and from there we start tweaking, making big little tweaks along the way and accommodating certain requests of the client. So, as you might figure, it's a very personal experience for both the artisan and the client, so both the service provider and the client. And today we'll be focusing on the aspect of being that sales associate or the middleman. Now, in some cases, the middleman is also the service provider, meaning if you are providing a service and you are the one making it, you might also be the one selling it. Now, in some cases, there is a middleman. And why does the middleman exist? Because more often than not, the sales provider can be a very difficult character to deal with, rather unpleasant. And so we have a space for sales associates in this form of work. People who can artfully negotiate, let's say. So let's run briefly through your commandments. First thing to remember is there is no substitute for human interaction. The second thing you must know is you must know your product. Once you know your product, you will be introduced and you must know your client. Once you know your client and you know your product, you have to be able to navigate the environment that you're in, and you have to be able to control the room. Once you're able to do all of that, you now have a solid foundation to build on which you can now tweak the way you speak in order to navigate, in order to intentionally navigate a conversation to where you'd like it to go. And after that, I'll give you my brief thoughts on the dignity of this occupation, because this is a career. And when you begin with a solid foundation and your actions are ordered to their proper ends, you'll do just fine. So first, let's discuss there's no substitute for human interaction. I want you to think about artisans of old and the patrons who supported their work. So perhaps one of the more recognizable works of art would be the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. Now, I want you to think about how much negotiation probably had to go through in order to fulfill this project, not just before the project began, but while the project was being completed, and even after the project was completed. As I'm sure you all know, sometimes when you deal with clients, in fact, most of the time when you deal with clients, you deal with certain demands. When you set expectations before the project begins, you make changes on the fly, and afterwards, they'll still have their comments and they might want you to change some things, hide some things, remove some things, add some things that you may not have even previously spoken about. And I want you to think about the guy who painted the Sistine Chapel. And his team, if he had one, the guys who set up the scaffolding, the guys who prepared the paints, the guys who prepared the models if they had. I want you to think about how that's such an arduous process of convincing your patron to pay for this because I need it for the completion of the project that you want. And that's where the tension is. And in that tension, we find our space. We find a space for the service that we do. We find a space for the skills that hopefully we're able to start building today or refine for those of you who are already initiated. Let's talk about briefly, as we will touch on this later on again, the fundamental skills of service. What do you need in order to be a competent sales associate? First off, is you need to have the capacity for human interaction. Now, what does this mean? Having the capacity for human interaction means you're fairly sociable. Now, you might say that being sociable is a type. Yes and no. Being sociable in our context today is the job, meaning whoever comes through that door, you have to say hello, you have to make eye contact, you have to make small talk, and you have to be present at all times for them. And trust me, it's not as awkward as you might think if you are lacking, if you feel that you were lacking in certain social skills. And today, hopefully, we refine that. Second is product knowledge. Product knowledge is competence. You know what you're selling, and that amounts to competence, which leads to respect, because you respect your job, you respect your product, you respect yourself in this occupation, and you respect the customer who is spending a good amount of time, perhaps a good amount of money on what you're trying to sell. And of course, all of that leads to a certain level of authority over the customer, authority over your colleagues, your subordinates. So we'll build on that with examples later on. The third is understanding the client. This is when you take it up a notch in terms of being sociable and you try to read the temperament, the mood, and perhaps how someone's day is going in the context of your work, because this all helps. Now, we have overlaps and we have exclusivities. So for example, if you have the capacity for human interaction and product knowledge, but you don't understand the client, you are a hobbyist or an enthusiast, meaning you're not trying to sell anything. You just know how to talk to people, you know about something, and you're building a community. This is common, but it's not ideal if you want to be a very good sales associate. If you have the capacity for human interaction and you understand the client, but you don't understand your product, you will talk a lot. You'll talk more than you need to, and you'll go in circles. But the worst thing is, you're not selling anything. And you're just talking. You're a conversationalist. And you'd be over-dependent on conversation, and you would probably get a bad review from your superior. And you also figure at the end of the month, you haven't really sold much just because you're such a friendly guy, but you're not talking about the job. And the third is if you understand the client and you have product knowledge, but you don't have the capacity for human interaction, you will likely overload the person whom you're talking to with information. And this is not ideal because it's the fastest way to lose someone and it's the fastest way to annoy somebody. Now, if you have all three, that's a spot where you want to be. That is the ideal. And hopefully we'll be building towards that today. So the first thing that's part of human interaction is the client acquaintance process. Now, the client acquaintance process is built on the idea of sales and how the idea of sales has evolved through the years. So let's take, for example, one approach where you bombard the client with information, perhaps a hard sell, which leads to an upsell once you have them listening. So now that they're listening, you try to sell more of what it is that you're trying to sell, or perhaps you're trying to sell something that's complementary to what you've already pitched. So the third is you close the sale. Once you do the transaction, they pay, it's over. You leave the client. And once you leave the client, you find the next client. Now, that cycle is not a cycle. That's a flow of events. It's a logical sequence of events that closes and starts anew. If you were to use a more sustainable approach, an actual cycle, you can start with knowing the client's needs. Now, knowing the client's needs is simply asking, what is the client going to use this for? Which leads to understanding your client. Why is my client attending this type of event? Or why is my client in need of this particular item with these specific details? And then you'd be able to recommend. Now, once you're able to recommend something, this is where product knowledge comes in, because you have an idea of what you're selling and you have an idea of what the client needs. You can now make the two meet. You reach an agreement precisely because you are asking the client to meet you at a certain place. You close the sale. And once you close the sale, that's when you upsell. After that, you'll find that the client will be able to trust you because you attacked directly what the client needed. You tried to understand who the client is, and you made an amicable agreement on reaching that common ground. When the client understands that this is how you approach your job, your client will also understand that you have the client's interests at heart. And not only that, but when you know your product, your client will be able to trust you because you have that authority now. And you have that authority precisely because you have these three skills. Now, an interaction always begins with a salutation and a greeting. So perhaps a handshake or a simple wave or a simple smile. We make eye contact, and eye contact is crucial because it is a sign of respect and it communicates certain ideas in a more dignified way. And you make certain facial expressions. Now, facial expressions are important because you have to be able to communicate a certain air of ease. You have to be able to put the client at ease. At all times, you must be a friend to the client rather than a sales associate. You mask the job of being a sales associate with being an amicable person, a friendly face. And normally, you just smile. You don't be smug. You don't grin. You don't frown. You just have a light facial expression. And that's enough. You have to modulate your voice. Now, I understand that voice modulation is rather subjective, and that's true. Take, for example, a set of clients of varying ages. Perhaps the elderly, if you have more elderly clients, they would need you to modulate your voice with a higher volume, but a lower, slower tempo of speech. You have to be aware of these things. Now, if your client is perfectly capable of carrying a conversation with normal speed of speech and volume, adjust accordingly. And if you're moved to a different culture where certain volumes are socially acceptable, then you should adjust accordingly. So you always have to be aware of who you're talking to and what environment you're in. And of course, you have to be mindful of where you put your hands. Now, I've spent a bit of time dealing with people in Italy, so my hands have taken on the habit of gesticulation. Now, this is no problem. It's not as important as you might think. The only important thing for you to remember is you don't exaggerate, you don't overdo it. And you don't flail your arms all over the place unless absolutely necessary. You need to have the capacity for small talk. And small talk can always be built on product knowledge. I understand that professionally, we shouldn't be delving too much into our own personal lives and the lives of our clients. So try to keep the boundaries of your small talk within the context of what it is that you're trying to sell. You can start off with the product, you can extend to the client and the client's hobbies, the client's lifestyle. Afterwards, you can talk about the community in which that belongs to, especially if the client is an enthusiast. This will be of particular help. And of course, after that, once you close the sale, or if you don't make a sale, always make the appropriate greeting to send off the client.
So that was the first chapter of Bermon's turn to discuss. If you learned something or would like to know more, do let us know in the comments section. We'll be uploading the next few chapters weekly, every Friday, so click subscribe so you can get notified when it comes out. See you next time.